They teach you geometry in school so that when you are a surgeon and there is a skin defect that must be removed, you start by drawing a circle around the defective area with diameter AB and radius CB. Then you extend CB equidistant to a point P, which will be the pivot point of the skin flap. Now on a piece of thread anchored at P, mark the distances of A and C to help draw an outer circle from point A with radius equal to 3 CB and an inner circle starting from point C with a radius equal to 2 CB. From point P, draw a line at 45 degrees to BP that will intersect the first circle at point X and the inner and outer circles at points D and D respectively. Start another circle at X with radius slightly less than CB. This outlines the primary flap that will be carved out to cover the original skin defect, and in the process create a new skin defect. But don't worry, because you will now make a secondary flap to cover that secondary defect. Draw a circle from D with radius slightly less than CB, but this time also create a triangular extension that can be closed up without the formation of giant dog ears. If done correctly, thanks to this bilobed skin flap, you will have successfully redirected tension vectors by borrowing skin laxity from surrounding areas. This surgical note flap resembles the musical eighth note. It is the simplest surgical transposition flap that was first described in India in 300 BC. A circle is drawn around the skin defect to be removed, making sure to include appropriate margins. Then a tangent to the edge of the circle radiates out parallel to the pull of skin tension. This should be exactly 1.5 times the diameter of the defect. A second line, 50 degrees to the first, finishes the shape of the musical note, with a length exactly equal to the diameter of the defect. The musical note is now ready to be incised. Since the donor flap is only around 3/4 the size of the defect, it needs to be undermined to allow enough stretching to cover the hole. The first suture should always be placed here, as this is where the most tension is. After that, the rest of the wound should be very easy to stitch up. The triangular flap can be slightly rounded to better fit the hole it must fill. When all remaining sutures are placed, we're left with the mirror image of a question mark. So next time you're playing piano, remember the surgical note flap, and wonder about which other notes could potentially be useful in surgery. Maybe even try carving fake skin flaps out of them. Let me demonstrate how surgically converting V's into Y's can save lives. Here's a catastrophic laceration. There's too much tension to close it without risking severe cheese wiring of the sutures and death of skin edges. To outsmart the tension, we carve a V underneath the wound and undermine it to produce a skin flap that can be advanced over the defect, allowing it to be stitched up free of tension. It is imperative not to form a sad flap, as blood supply to the tip will be compromised. Happy flaps are always the way to go, and we have now successfully created a new wound underneath the old one. So you might think this was a stupid idea, and that all we have done is transfer the tension to this new incision, as trying to suture each arm of the V will prove the flap to be way too small to close the area now. But this tension is now working in our favor, as it brings the walls of the base of the V together, allowing easy closure. These V2Y Advancement Flaps are commonly applied in eyelid surgery, where it is crucial that the structures around the wound are preserved and distortion is prevented. It can even be used as the Warch-Jones blepharoplasty technique to correct ectropion. In 1946, Alexander Limburg designed the skin flap to fill a rhomboid-shaped defect. In case you forgot, a rhombus is a parallelogram in which all sides are equal and the short and long diagonals bisect each other at 90 degrees. Now to remove the skin defect, let's draw a circle around it, which is the incircle of the 60-degree rhombus ABCD we get by also sacrificing some normal skin. A 60-degree Limburg flap CBEF is drawn by continuing the short diagonal of our rhombus. ABCDEF can now be incised to discard the skin defect. Then the Limburg flap is undermined and lifted to cover ABCD. It's important not to incise CF, as it provides blood supply to keep the Limburg flap alive. The first suture should always be tied at B, which is the point of maximum tension, so that the flap lies over the defect. The next suture is tied at A to fix the flap in position so that all the other sutures are now easy to place. As you can see, we got great coverage of the defect without much tension. However, carefully engineering a rhomboid defect this way not only sacrifices healthy skin around the defect, but also limits the choice of donor flaps to only 4. Surgeons sometimes have to draw ice cream to help close holes in the skin. For the ice cream cone skin flap technique, a circle of the same diameter is drawn next to the defect, resembling a scoop of ice cream. Let's call the point at which they touch point A. A tangent to both circles radiates out from point A with a length equal to the diameter of the circles. Then another tangent to the ice cream from point B forms a 60-degree angle with the first tangent at point E to create the ice cream cone. It is very important to make sure to draw the cone on the ice cream and not on the defect. The length of arch AB is calculated by dividing its 120-degree angle by 360 and multiplying that by the circumference formula, which is 2 pi radius. Therefore, the arch is approximately equal to the diameter and a third of the entire circumference of the ice cream scoop. The ice cream cone ABD must be deepithelialized. An incision is then made around 2/3 of the ice cream scoop to leave an adequate blood blood supply to the flap. One edge of the triangular area is also incised to form the skin flap that will go over the deepithelialized cone. Once the sutures are placed, it should all fit together very nicely, and not how it looks like on this fake skin. I'll show you how carving the letter Z next to this high tension wound can help close it, but to pull off this Zplasty, careful planning of the Z incision is needed. First, the region around the original defect must be manipulated to locate an area with an adequate amount of skin, because the whole point of a Zplasty as the relaxing incision is to move skin from where it is readily available to where it is needed to relieve tension. The central limb of the Z is carved parallel to the line of tension and 90 degrees to the primary wound closure. These 3 incisions of the Z should be of equal length to be neatly sutured together after transposition. And the longer the length of these incisions, the more relaxation you will achieve, but using longer lengths may be restricted by the looseness of the skin in the area. Angles of 60 degrees between the incisions are most commonly used since larger angles put more tension on surrounding tissues, and smaller ones produce narrow flaps with an insufficient blood supply, causing them to die and fall off. Once the skin between the incisions is undermined, the original wound can finally be closed. As the tension from the wound is transferred to the Z incision, the elevated flaps will begin to transpose and can be sutured to form a reverse Z. If you see a scar resembling the last letter of the Greek alphabet, it may mean an omega flap was used to repair a circular skin defect. To create an omega advancement flap, a circle of the same diameter is drawn next to the defect, which touches it at point A. Then a tangent is drawn to both circles that passes through A. Another tangent of equal length is drawn on both sides, and these intersect the first tangent at a 60-degree angle. The resulting equilateral triangles are deepithelialized to avoid standing cones when the circular skin flap is lifted and advanced to cover the circular skin defect. In comparison to the majority of skin flaps that are planned in an angled shape, the omega skin flap does not require healthy tissue to be sacrificed around the defect to make it the same shape as the skin flap. It is also a step forward from the square peg in a round hole technique, where a rhomboid flap is forced to fit into a round defect. And once the sutures are placed, there should be minimal tension on the omega-shaped scar line, especially in comparison to if the circular defect was to be closed without any help. The last letter of the English alphabet also has its own surgical technique called the Zplasty, so it seems like the best letters are always saved for last. Would you believe me if I said a spaceship can help remove this tumor growing under the skin? When a mass is removed, we're often left with a big hole in the skin, and there's too much tension to pull the edges together. So we need to use a reconstructive technique called advancement flaps. Different style advancement flaps are chosen depending on the shape and location of the defect. Since tumors may invade beyond what is obvious to the naked eye, margins of apparently healthy tissue also have to be removed. For tumors suspected of being more invasive, wider margins are needed, and biopsies can help determine what margins are appropriate for each case. To form the advancement flaps, a triangle is drawn around the margins we want to remove. However, if we try to close a triangular area, folds of excess skin will form. We want to prevent this, so the base of the triangle is extended and 2 smaller triangles are added to remove the excess skin. Now we can cut out the spacecraft using a scalpel, and undermining the skin flaps releases them from their attachments underneath so they can be advanced from both sides to cover the hole. Finally, all that's left to do is suture all the edges together, and that's how spacecrafts help remove tumors. Here's how surgeons make square pegs fit into round holes. The square peg in a round hole modification of the Limburg flap allows a circular defect to be filled with a smaller rhomboid skin flap without sacrificing normal skin to make the defect into a rhombus. Thanks to an abundance of collagen and elastin, healthy skin can usually stretch to be around 30% larger than its relaxed size. So let's say we remove a skin tumor and are left with a circular defect with a radius of 3 centimeters. To fill the 28 centimeter square area of this defect, we will need a 60-degree rhombus with a side length of around 6 centimeters. But adjusted for elasticity, the skin flap will only need to have a side length of around 4 centimeters. So to make a square peg in a round hole skin flap, the radius of the skin defect is extended 2/3 of the diameter of the defect. Then a line of equal length is drawn 60 degrees to this to accomplish a rhomboid flap that is smaller than the defect it must fill, so must be carefully undermined to be maximally stretched. Although the metaphor square peg in a round hole refers to a person assigned the wrong job, in this case it all somehow works out in the end. And keeping the defect circular allows more flexibility when deciding on donor sites, so we can choose whichever results in the least tension on the suture lines.